This is the 46 of 46 podcast Summit Sessions, where we'll talk all things Adirondack, backcountry, and beyond. From high peak stories and adventures to trail tips and tricks, we'll dive deep into the heart of these mountains and the people who passionately climb them. Adirondack maps and spruce traps, bushwhacks and backpacks. It's all here on the 46 of 46 Summit Sessions. Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome back to another Summit Session here on the 46 of 46 podcast. This week, we're going to venture off the trails and talk about another outdoor subject that's often misunderstood, yet surprisingly similar in nature to hiking, camping, and backpacking and what we're used to hearing. And like hiking, it involves being in tune with the land, knowing how to navigate through the woods, read signs found in nature. However, unlike hiking, it also involves being very competent with a rifle or a bow. Yep, I'm talking about the age-old topic of hunting. With 6 million acres of woods and little population density, you could imagine hunting in the Adirondacks is a popular activity here and has been a way of life for people in the park for centuries. And yes, I'm very aware that this podcast usually talks about hiking and backpacking, but in reality, it is an outdoor show first and foremost, and more than that, it's a show that highlights adventures typically had in the Adirondack Park, and hunting fits the bill. Hunting is also an activity that I feel is quite misunderstood, especially amongst the hiking community and the anti-hunting community, though I feel there's a lot more commonalities than you may think. It's an activity and a way of life as ancient as time and remains intact to this very day, albeit often under attack from those who don't quite understand it. And I hope this episode will give you a chance to learn something new and perhaps even gain a new perspective on a subject matter that you may not be as familiar with as we address common misconceptions regarding the hunting community. I also have the perfect guest to discuss all things hunting. He's an Adirondack native, he's the host of the East-West Hunting Podcast and the Outdoor Feast Podcast. He's an avid deer and bird hunter, a fisherman, and a member of numerous conservation organizations, and he holds a bachelor's degree in natural resource management. His name is Todd Waldron, and he's here tonight to chat with me all about hunting, conservation, and how the subjects go hand in hand, while also clearing up common misconceptions those two subjects often have from the general public. Without further ado, Todd, thanks so much for coming on the 46 of 46 podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
James, it's great to be here. I'm a big fan of your podcast, and it's a real pleasure. Looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, I appreciate that very much. I'm also a big fan of your podcast. I listen to it quite regularly. And this is an episode that I've had on my list for quite a while now, and I'm glad you were interested in coming on the show to discuss this subject. You know, you being an Adirondack native, an avid hunter, and on top of it all, a podcaster, so clearly somebody who can speak and, you know, you're well-spoken and well-educated. You really were the perfect guest to discuss this subject, so thanks so much for being here with me. And to start us off, just give us a little bit about yourself, a little background. How'd you get into the outdoors and hunting in particular? Maybe tell us a little bit about the conservation work that you're involved with.
Yeah, that sounds great, James. So thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And like you said, I am an Adirondack native. I grew up in the North Creek region, which is in the southeastern Adirondacks. And, you know, my outdoor experience was through immersion with my family, mostly my dad, but my entire family, really. My grandparents, they had a wood lot in North Creek where they cut firewood to heat their home in the winter in North Creek. And so, you know, I can remember being outdoors with them as early as like 5 and 6 years old. So it was always an immersion kind of thing for me. So, you know, I just kind of grew up in a family that was into the outdoors, that we hunted, we fished, you know, it's just kind of what we did. So, you know, that was something that for me, it just kind of came naturally. And I just spent a lot of time with my family outside. For a lot of people today, though, you know, maybe they don't grow up in an outdoor family. So as they're kind of thinking about in terms of how they might get started with hunting or angling, they have to kind of look beyond that traditional resource of just like having a family member, like a father, an uncle, or a mom, whatever the case may be, that might introduce them to it. So that's kind of what drives me with part of the my background in conservation and mentorship is just introducing people to the outdoors who may not have had that same kind of experience as I did. I was really fortunate growing up here. And just like my outdoor experiences too, along with hunting and fishing, those are things that I identify with. But I also, like everybody else here in the Adirondacks, love to hike, love to camp. So, to this day, I'm married. We have a young daughter. We go camping every summer. We like to kayak and we love to hike. The first mountain that I think I've ever hiked in the Adirondacks was Crane Mountain in Warren County in the Lake George region. And it's still one of my favorites. So, it's like something that I think that for people that love the outdoors, we all just kind of like, there's a lot of things that we gravitate towards. So a lot of different identities and a lot of communities that we can kind of cross over into. And then, with my conservation work, I kind of was shaped with my career path into this conservation kind of space. And I've worked in forest conservation my entire career. And so in a lot of different capacities, but there's been kind of like two identities with that. One is the professional space where I've been working in forest conservation and forestry consulting. And now just recently took a position with Ruffed Grouse Society as their forest conservation director, working on forest habitat issues here in the Northeast, which we can talk about after. But there's been that. And then there's also this personal passion to get involved with the wildlife conservation space too. And most of that was through volunteer work. So I've spent a lot of time volunteering for organizations like Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, for instance, which is a public lands advocacy group based in Montana, but we have a chapter here in New York. We do a lot of cleanups and stuff like that. So just always kind of like in those spaces, that's kind of like what works for me and my personal interests and passions. And so, that's kind of what shaped the whole thing, got me interested in podcasting, being able to share some of that stuff with the audience. And I'm glad to be able to talk about it tonight.
Yeah, it's great. And it's one of those things that you mentioned, you grew up here and you grew up around the mountains and around the outdoors and in the outdoors. And it's something that it's so easy to forget and kind of take for granted when you just grew up and it was just a way of life. Like you don't know other things. It's so easy to forget that the skills that you've had and you've made and, the activities that you grew up doing aren't so natural to other people when that's just all you've known. And as anyone who grows up around here, that typically is the case. You're used to seeing the woods and the mountains and playing in the woods. That's where you went to have fun. You didn't, we don't have arcades here, so we would just go play in the woods. That's what we do. So it makes perfect sense that that's kind of how your life has developed. And it's interesting. So right off the bat, we're doing this episode on hunting and, with my listenership being mostly, like the outdoorsy hiking types, I know 100% that so many people listening to the show probably have quite a few misconceptions about hunting, and they're probably curious where I'm going with this episode. But right off the bat, I want to start off with touching again on all those things you said. You are a hunter, so you're not some malicious killer in the woods with a rifle in your hand. You are involved in so many conservation organizations and efforts to make sure everything is the wildlife is flourishing and everything is going well, with the lands and the animals. So right off the bat, I think that's, a very important kind of foundational topic to talk about with hunters. And most hunters that I know are just so about conservation and they're so in tune with the land and the animals involved with the land. So why do you think that it's so often kind of overlooked that hunters are usually big advocates for the land and for conservation in particular?
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there and talk about. So I'm excited to talk about that, James. And I'll back up too. And the point you made about the skill set, about being outdoors and having a certain skill set here in the Adirondacks, whether that's mountaineering or hiking, backpacking, all of that stuff. So there's that part of it, right? And then there's also the part of it in terms like culturally, do I see myself in this space or not? And so do I see myself being invited into this space, into this community? And that's where I'm going with this, with the hunting thing, is that for a lot of people, if you don't grow up hunting, and optically, what you see is maybe snapshots of some images or some perceptions of what you see on TV, some quick media clips or some pictures. You just get these ideas in your head about what hunters are all about. And there's such quick snapshots that I can understand where people might just feel like, okay, I don't really get this, or, I'm seeing this optically, these images, and I'm just not quite comfortable with it. That just doesn't seem like something that I can see myself doing. So like totally get all that when I'm having these conversations about hunting. And so, I think with hunting, the thing that really for me, I can speak to my experience, and I can speak to the people that I surround myself with the same ethic about it and how we approach it from a conservation stewardship perspective. And so that's where I'm coming from in this conversation. There's like anything else, there's 11 million hunters in North America. So there's a wide range of perspectives of why people hunt, why they do what they do. But I can share some experience personally. Okay.
Sure.
And so
please do.
Yeah, so I would just say that if you look at wildlife conservation and you look at the trajectory in the United States and how it formed in the early 20th century, the whole concept behind the funding of it and the protections, it was actually, a lot of it was started and initiated within the hunting community. It was started and initiated with people like Theodore Roosevelt, who was a New Yorker, right?
Mm-hmm.
And became governor, became president. Also a New Yorker named George Bird Grinnell, turn of the 20th century. We have these natural resource crises coming out of the 1800s. And so they kind of imagined this, what's called the North American model of wildlife conservation. And it was in part, it was being funded by hunters. Okay, so they kind of came up with this regulated approach that would be science-based, looking at wildlife as a public resource for everybody, whether they hunt or not, but putting some ethics and putting some regulations around it, grounding the management in science, and then funding the thing through licensed sales and through excise taxes and everything like that. So from a very early standpoint, the whole conservation movement in America, which is very fluid and dynamic, as we all know, but hunting had a place in that. And still today, like from a conservation standpoint, still producing a lot of funding for state wildlife agencies, and also things like the Conservation Fund, specifically in New York. Hunting revenue is something like $30 to $40 million a year in license sales here in New York. And so those license sale monies go into the Conservation Fund, which funds DEC's wildlife programs, for instance. And then there's some other funding around it as well. So from a functional standpoint, that's kind of how that kind of initiated, and it still plays a big part. And obviously conservation, there's so many parts to it, and there's so many different funding tools now. We're so fortunate, whether you hunt or not, to have some of the conservation funds that we've got. The Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is an excise tax on oil, permanently funded last year. So, a lot of different mechanisms and a lot of different ways to fund this stuff. But that's kind of like the history with hunting. And so I would say, that's an important kind of part of it, is this North American model of wildlife conservation. The other thing I would say is that there's a kind of a structural shift in hunting going on right now, which is really kind of demographically driven, James. And so what's happening is all of the people that are like my dad's age, my uncle, the baby boomers, for instance. I'm a Gen Xer, by the way, but my dad's a baby boomer. And so all of those folks are starting to age out of hunting. And in 1980, there were something like 17 million hunters in the country. And last year or two, we were down to about 11 million. And so there's this kind of like existential shift on what's going to happen with hunting in its future, not only with the, kind of the tradition of it, but like how things fun, like what we were just talking about.